I talk about language, but it is purposeful. I think part of the advocacy, part of when we talk about mental health, and this is really driven from liberation psychology, which really tries to understand the person outside of their circumstances, right? So when we think about immigration status even as a determinant of health, right, as a social construct, there's nothing in a person's body, in their spirit, that is undocumented, right? It's a circumstance that they're experiencing. It's something that they're experiencing and facing, but there's nothing about them inherently that makes them undocumented. So yes, that was very purposeful.
Got it.
Yeah. So with that, I think that's a great segue into talking about the impact of language. One of the things that, I'll share with you briefly that was really impactful for me, I recently did a presentation at a high school, and I had a high school teacher ask me, after we were talking about sort of the impact of language and how do we talk about immigration status, how does our community members identify themselves, say, I'm having a hard time saying the word detention in school. Right? So when I'm handing out detention, right, to students, I don't know how to, that feels really heavy, right? So I share that with you all because we live in a society, we live in a system that uses language very strategically, right? We're thinking about language as ways to oppress individuals, as ways to dehumanize individuals, to criminalize individuals, to condition individuals. So the intent versus the impact of language can be very psychological, right? So when we think about immigration status and documented legal status as a construct, right, versus an identity. I think that that's a really important thing to kind of think about as we're seeing our community members, some community members being very open about their status, being very proud about their identities, right? Thinking about how that is shaping their wellness as well, their autonomy, their self-advocacy. I think another thing to think about from a policy perspective, from a community organizing perspective, from a healing perspective, to think about, when we talk about, refugees, right? It feels so different to say refugees versus a person who is seeking refuge, right? When we're able to detach that status, that dehumanizing and oppressive label and name from the person, we give power to the person, right? Personally, I never identified as a dreamer, right? I would participate in a lot of different spaces where people would give me that identity, or would sort of showcase their fundraising efforts as for dreamers, by dreamers. And I never identified with that label or with that narrative, even though I fit the characteristics, right? Because for me, it was just reinforcing sort of the colonization, right? Sort of the good immigrant narrative. And unfortunately, as much as we want to highlight the power and the resilience of our community, right? The intent versus the impact and the outcome of language can also be very harmful. So that's just an example of why I think about language. And language can be very empowering. And so as we're thinking about, when we're working with our community, right, when we're engaging in a dialogue with our community, how do we position ourselves or create moments where people can create that self-identification, right? So it's important to have sort of like an idea and a construct, right, of what that is, and various ways in which community members identify. But when we give individuals, when we create moments and spaces for individuals to really explore that self-identity outside of their immigration status, that can be so healing, right? That can be so powerful. And oftentimes, right, we can also get into the heuristics of like, this is what a dreamer is, right? This is what a DACA student is. This is what, right? And so putting things into boxes, it's important to know the information and why, right? But the identification piece is so important. And I bring this into this space in this discussion of mental health because where we're at politically, right? Who is deserving of citizenship, right? We have the DACA hearings coming up, right? We're in a tense place where a lot of these labels are going to be thrown back and forth. And so we want to make sure that we're using them effectively and that we're using them with an inclusivity mindset. Lastly, just in terms of the 5 faces of oppression, in the context of language, I think we have seen this, right, manifest in the last couple of years during the Trump administration. I mean, not that this hasn't been existent in our experiences as undocumented immigrant folks, but we can start to see how language, right, can really manifest in the exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, and silence and cultural imperialism and violence of our community members. It can go from exploitation to hate speech, right, to hate crime. So that's just kind of an example to give you all.
Thank you for that. For everything you just said. It's like, it could be pretty radical, and I think sometimes hard to grasp just the pervasiveness of language and how much we use it in our everyday. And I myself can speak in a way that, while intention is a great intention, its impact can be in a way it doesn't move forward what I really intended, right, which was liberation or freedom. I know that one activity that we did with a group of students, we did an activity with them where we had a group of students come together, and one of our colleagues kind of had the idea, and it's like, think about all of the ways that people label you. Yeah. So undocumented, woman, this, people just kind of went through everything, and then the activity was to then write a narrative that did not include any of that. Right. That did not include any of those words. That did not include any of that. And so people beginning to really notice, well, who am I really outside of all of these characteristics that are prone to how I'm supposed to be identified? So really, really great, everything you said. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and just to kind of, briefly add to your point, right? And that's an incredible activity, right? That could really provide an opportunity for young people, for human beings to explore their identity outside of their circumstances, right? That their circumstances doesn't define who they are, right? But may provide information about the world, right? In different ways, different coping strategies, and different levels of resilience, right? I think when we think about the person outside of that circumstance, right, we can really try to explore self-esteem and self-worth, right, which when we think about immigration status, right, and we think about the sort of the health outcomes of it, right, I mean, this is a status intentionally intended to oppress a community, right, because the more oppressed we are, the less time we have to fight back, right, because we're in constant survival mode. And so to this slide, just like as I was saying, right, earlier, I think really separating the two is, yeah, it is radical in that way. I think it's also adding to the liberation psychology process. I think that both myself, I've been, on a healing journey about who I am outside of my immigration status. How does my story define parts of myself, right? And I think, introducing this idea to the community has been interesting, because there's also a lot of pride in saying I'm undocumented and I'm unafraid. And I'll get into that a little later as well as we talk about fear. There's a lot of pride of that. There's been a lot of movement in that, right? And this is not to take away from it, right? And this is also to emphasize that this is complex, right? Which is, again, why it's important to create spaces for this process to happen, right? For people to engage in their own thoughts and insights about how they identify and why they identify that way. From a trauma-informed care perspective, and also strength-based approach, this, person-centered language is really what this is. So really addressing the person. This is also a concept very much existent in mental health, right? And a lot of advocacy has been happening also in mental health. So for example, in mental health, we would not refer to someone in the context of their mental health concern, circumstances, or diagnosis, right? We would refer to the person. So an example could be, we would not refer to a person as autistic, right? We would refer them to a person who has autism, right? Or a person who meets criteria for this. I'm saying that as an example because I think that might resonate with some folks. And I think that this is also an effort to try to bridge in some of the mental health advocacy when we're talking about immigration status. So again, when we use externalizing language, and one of the example being a person who's seeking refuge, a person who has an undocumented legal status, we're removing the problem from the person and we get to humanize that person's experience, right? Instead of saying, this is the problem and this is why you're feeling this, right? We want to say like, what has happened, right? Again, another aspect of person-centered language and a strengths-based approach is really setting people as the experts, right? They are the experts in their lives. They know best, right? They've probably learned various different coping strategies to address their stressors. And they are the owners and the authors of their stories. So again, when we're engaging with the community on various levels and spectrums, right? People are on a spectrum of where they're at in terms of their identity, right? Their advocacy, their community organizing, right? And we know this across the community because that has been definitely a resilient factor of a lot of young people who have an undocumented legal status, right? That's how we were able to get DACA. But really positioning ourselves as also the learners, right? So as service providers, how do we do that? And what is the language that we are using, right? To position ourselves as collaborators, as learners, as students, rather than the experts of their story. So really giving them that self-autonomy and building that democracy in the conversations that we're having with our community members. Another piece of person-centered language and just strengths-based approach is really the reauthoring of stories, right? So some examples in the context of trauma could be, like the butterfly metaphor, right? And docu-joy. One example could be migration is beautiful to like, sometimes migration is not beautiful, right? But migration is a natural process. And then again, the other piece, the undocumented and unafraid movement and identity. And, I myself, as a developing researcher of fear, right? I was out in the street saying I'm undocumented and unafraid, right? And I think this piece right here has recently become a little bit more of a conversation for me, just in terms of how we think about fear, especially for community members that are impacted by immigration status right now, right? That you can be dialectical in your understanding and practice of even fear, right? That you can experience fear as a normal human response, an appropriate response to various stressors that are threatening, right? And that survival response is there for a reason. And you can also be unafraid, right? As a resilient immigrant and documented person, you can show up in spaces and say like, I'm here, I'm showing up, and I'm not afraid. So I think that there's a complexity behind that. But anyway, that's an example to kind of share. These are some of the common factors to building a therapeutic safe alliance relationship, which I did not cite in here, but this is really coming from Dr. Germán Cadenas, which I'll share a resource a little later, who is one of my mentors, one of my teachers around this. So I definitely invite you to check him out. But this is, again, right, a collaborative dialogue and process between you and the student, right? So how do you engage in problem solving? How do you know that it's time to problem solve, right? While also opening up space to process emotions, to normalize even some of the physical symptoms that you might be seeing with that student in that meeting. Again, right, so identifying a safe space. Does the student have agency over that, right? Again, students are the experts in their experiences and how they feel. Building trust is really important. Language is one of them, right? Those are some of the things that we can think about, how we're building trust with language. Building democracy in different engagements and dialogues that we have. And again, right, the goal is for students to connect with their individual experience if we're doing some process. And some of the processing that I'm speaking to could be community dialogues, right? If there's a prompt, if you're facilitating an UndocuTalk, if you are leading a group of students that identify as undocumented. We'll go to the next slide. I want to be mindful of time as well. How much time do I have, Stephanie? Pardon me? Ooh, I think you're muted. 10 minutes. Got it. Yay. Nonverbal communication, 10 minutes. Okay, great. So I'll go into fear. I'll probably go through it a little quicker than I hoped. And then I'll spend a little bit more time on the trauma piece. So fear, we can go to, oh, here's a lion, right? You know, I start with the image of a lion because I think it provides an example of what fear might feel like for most of us. So imagine yourself, you're in a quiet space, you're at your most comfortable, peaceful, baseline, you know, place, and you see or you hear that there's a lion around you, right? What are some of the things that are gonna happen? Well, I often ask folks, like, you know, what do you think is going to happen, right? And people will tell me, like, I'm going to hide, I'm going to run, or I'm going to try to, like, fight this lion, right? What is common about those responses is that we're all going to try to save ourselves, right? That survival response is there for a reason. It's automatic, right? It's supposed to happen. Whenever we are at, you know, facing any kind of threat, right, that could end our lives in some way or another, that fight or flight response is going to kick in. We can go to the next slide. So that is a fear response, right? And that happens when our, you know, when our autonomic nervous system is activated, right? Again, this is our fight or flight freeze response. So again, some people might run, some people might hide, right, which would be the example of freeze, or freeze literally, or fight, or try to fight back. So now, when we think about the chronic activation, right, of this response, let's say that the idea of that lion is there, right, constantly, or that lion is there. So if we think about Trump, if we think about the current political climate, if we think about racism and oppression as that lion, right, that is that lion present in most of our lives, right, constantly activating our autonomic nervous system. It's not supposed to be there, right? If this system is constantly being activated, right, that's going to create a response, a stress response in our bodies, which happens if we were at, you know, in front of a lion. A lot of internal things would happen, right? Our heart rate would go up, our blood pressure might go up, right? We would lose appetite, our hands would become really sweaty, right? Because we're preparing to do something. However, if this is happening over and over and over and over again, you can imagine if this is happening 3-5 times a day, you might hear an ICE raid happening in your community. Someone might, you know, get pulled over, right? Somebody might face a microaggression about their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or identity, right? The body might experience that. The body does experience it as a threat. The body does experience it very similarly to this. So these are some of the ways in which, you know, with unresolved fear, so meaning if it happens over and over and over and over again, and it's chronic and constant, these could be some of the physical and psychological effects of it, right? It'll impact our immune system. We can certainly, you know, experience insults to the brain, damage to the brain. It can lead to more acute stress, anxiety, panic, depression, and even premature death. So even when we think about some of the deaths that have been happening in the concentration camps, right, the detention centers that are there, you know, I think about this, right? We're putting human beings under so much stress that this is getting built up to that point. Again, duration and context matters, right? Because that lion, right, is real for our communities. That lion does exist, right? It has a name. It's had a name for a really long time. And it's real. I'm not going to go into that, but hopefully this will be available to you all so you can go and check it out. It's just a video that kind of highlights exactly everything that I've talked about. So we'll go to the next slide. Again, one of the things that's really important when I talk about the mental health and the wellness of our communities and why context matters is that when we talk about depression and anxiety, right, we have to think about, obviously, the sociocultural and the sociopolitical factors that are reinforcing these experiences and these situations that cause a lot of stress. So the DSM might not really, you know, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual for, you know, psychological conditions might not really define or describe the experiences that our communities are facing. However, this does not mean that with constant and chronic fear, our bodies don't hold that in, right? We're also talking about intergenerational trauma, right? We're talking about the effects of colonialism that is sitting in our bodies, right? That we're carrying from our ancestors. So we're really talking about a lot of stress that our bodies can hold. I'm going to stop there. I think I'm getting a cue that no, keep going. Okay. So again, kind of with that in mind, when we think about trauma, right? So a trauma could be something, it's the situation where somebody feels like they are not in control of that situation, right? Again, that fight or flight response might kick in. And that fear response eventually might inform a trauma response, but we'll go into that a little later. Migration trauma is something to consider and think about, right, as we're working with different community members. So what does that look like for them? How do we engage with them in safe conversations where they feel like they don't have to share details of their history? I think there's a question popping up. Again, I've already talked about this, but sort of the ongoing trauma, right? So these are everyday experiences that people may face when they, you know, step out of their household, right? So navigating different systems, talking and having to re-explain themselves and their situations, possibly expecting sort of a fear response from engaging with someone or a system, an institution that might out them, right? And different, you know, different barriers and microaggressions that might exist. With that, I mean, I think, you know, we know that, you know, the rhetoric, right, has been, you know, the racialization and criminalization of immigrants of color. So when we see, you know, what we see in the media, right, you know, that's very real for our communities, right? So even having sort of that fear of going out and being, you know, racially profiled or microaggressed or discriminated, I know has also been showing up for even, you know, U.S. citizens of color, right? So I think that we can really start to see how obviously immigration is race-based. An act of deportation versus deportability. This is a concept that I'm drawing into trauma because when we think about, you know, when someone has experienced a deportation, that is a traumatic experience, right? just like when we talk about trauma and complex trauma. So experiencing a traumatic event, like one single event, versus experiencing constant trauma because of the environment that one is, right? The act of deportation, right? One single event versus essentially being racialized and criminalized, and that's setting one up into a point of deportability. That, in everything we do or we engage in, we're at risk of deportation, if you will, because of our various identities and our immigration status. Next slide, please. So again, with trauma-informed care, as we think about, trauma and the fear response, yes, there is a difference between the two. There's a lot of intersection or interaction, I should say, between fear and trauma. So when we experience a trauma response, let's say, right, we may feel fearful, right? But again, some of the ways in which we can stabilize the nervous system, right? So if we think about that ANS system being activated, that stress response, we're really talking about, physiologically sort of getting ourselves back grounded into our bodies. And that could really come from using specific language that is inclusive and welcoming, right? Talking about confidentiality, so setting that safe space. So really addressing that in the work that we do, and when we talk, or allowing people to ask us about how who we're talking to, why we're talking to, and where their paperwork is going, who is seeing their paperwork. Addressing power dynamics, again, right, in the spaces that we engage in, and part of that can really get at stabilizing the central nervous system. Some specific things, like breathing exercises, are ways to really help get this part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, activated so that we can think about decisions, right? And we can engage in problem solving, and people can be present in their bodies to be, authors and the owners of their own story and the problem solving process with them. Should I check this? Okay. So again, fear is a learned response. I won't go too much into PTSD itself, but just definitely want to say that fear, trauma, PTSD, if you will, and anxiety are very different, right? So when we are engaging with the community, there are different ways to understand those experiences, but that fear may live in all of these, right? Fear can inform anxiety, right? Fear can inform PTSD. And so it can very much go into this very cyclical sort of pattern, right? When we have something constantly triggering a particular response. Again, these are obviously some of the stressors that our community, some of the trauma stressors that our communities are experiencing. I'll go to the next slide. I think I already spoke to this. So I'll just go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So again, these are some ways in which trauma can manifest physiologically and cognitively. So physiologically, it can impact our sleep, muscle tension, right? Which all of them can really lead to, they put us at risk for more illnesses like a cold, right? If our bodies are in constant stress, right, we're going to be more prone to catching a particular virus. The cognitive process, right, that can really impact our memory. It can, lead us to feeling disorganized, having difficulties with attention. Obviously, we can see how this could be a barrier to learning. There are a couple, psychological, depression, anxiety, PTSD, hypervigilance, and guardedness. And the last one, and behavioral, missed deadlines, late arrivals, no-shows, difficulties with making or keeping appointments. I think that as we also kind of think about all these different responses, right? The body is just trying to survive, right? And it's going to do everything possible to maintain or to go back to that homeostasis and that stability. And with resolved fear, we can go back to that, right? We can go back to our baseline. But if the context doesn't change, right? If the sociocultural, sociopolitical factors and stressors don't change, if our immigration status does not change, that's going to make it very, very difficult. So again, fear and trauma, they're not the same, but fear may inform trauma responses as well as anxiety. Fear is a learned response used to defend, protect ourselves from an identifiable threat. We need to address the sociocultural and political context, right? So we do need to change that. We do need to change our immigration system. There's a constant activation, right, of a fight or flight response. That, is very much tied to violence, racism, prejudice, the ongoing effects of colonialism, right? That can all manifest in cognitive and behavioral, psychological responses like mistrust, hypervigilance, paranoia, anxiety, and so on and so forth. And again, these are survival responses from our community. So again, the point here is not to pathologize our communities, right? Not to bring in also Western white psychology and try to explain the experiences of our communities, but to really try to understand the ongoing effects of an unchanged system, right? That is oppressive and that's dehumanizing, and that it's there to reinforce these that stress response in our bodies. Lastly, Dr. Cadenas, one of my mentors, somebody that I look up to very much. Obviously, I'm not the only one doing this work. I have a lot of mentors, a lot of teachers that are doing amazing work. I invite you to check out Informed Immigrant as well as his work. These are some resources that just came out that you can also print at, and you can put in your classroom, in your house, and these are some things to just remind the community of how resilient they are, right? And how powerful they are, and some ways in which we can continue to create safe spaces where people can show up as themselves. So be in community, make a safety plan, and then I believe the last slide is identify safe people and safe and spaces. So, if you are one of those people, right, it's a gift. Trusting, building that trust with the community is so essential and so powerful. So, thank you all for doing this work, very hard work. But, community healing is really, it really comes from the heart. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lily. And then is this the best email to contact you at, or is
the first slide? Yeah, I think either that one or my Immigrants Rising, which is lilycampos@immigrantsrising.org.
Okay, perfect. And so then, thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, we will leave room towards the end as well to answer any questions. And so just so much wisdom in what you shared, everything really from language to context to the way fear informs trauma, like just the way that everything comes together, the cyclicalness of some of these behaviors, right, in some of these situations. So thank you for that. I really, for the people that as you work with students on the daily, I begin to notice some of this. And then just as you shared at the very end, then create community, like really create community and create the space for people to be around, people that they know really care about them, which I think is the next example, really the next example of what we have. Here are the references, so you all can access those, which is from Olivia and Maria. And so Olivia and Maria are here. They won't be on video, and they have so much to bring. We just spoke recently, and they are really doing great work. And in that last comment that Lily made about bringing community together, from students in high school to students in colleges and even parents. And so I'm just gonna open the floor for you all to share, introduce yourselves, and then let us know a little bit more about your work.
Thank you so much for asking us to share some of the work that we're doing. We really appreciate it. Again, I'm Olivia Rosas, and I serve our students as the Associate VP of Student Success and Educational Equity and the Undocumented Student Success Center at Cal State San Bernardino under the leadership of Maria Barragan is one of the units under my supervision or, portfolio. So thank you again.
Yeah.
And, hi, everyone. My name is Maria Barragan. I am the lead coordinator for the Undocumented Student Success Center at Cal State San Bernardino. So we do want to share some of the work that we are doing with our high school students, our college students, as well as the parents. To start off, some of the work that we do with high school students is revisiting the outreach strategies. So before, when high school counselors used to reach out to me to invite me to present to their students, I would just go in, give the students an info session about the resources available to undocumented students. But as students started coming into my campus and sharing with me, what really stuck out to them was when I would share my story and when I would tell them, this is that experience that I had. So then I said, maybe I need to take a step back and really revisit how I do my outreach. So what I started doing is some high school counselors started posting flyers around campus saying, are you undocumented? Are you a dreamer? Please email counselor so-and-so. Once the students would contact the counselor would provide them with a meeting date, a location, and a time. And then I would go and I meet with the students, and what I initially do now is I start off by putting students in a circle and facilitating a conversation to really meet students where they are at, right? So making sure that if they have questions regarding their financial aid, if they just want to have a conversation of this is what's happening right now, this is what's affecting me, I feel like I can't do it, right? Really giving them those words of affirmation and saying, yes, you can. I believe in you. And because I believe in you, we're going to make this happen. Whether you end up at Cal State San Bernardino or you end up at another institution, I'm very blessed to say that at the end of the day, they do end up, most of them coming to Cal State San Bernardino because we start building that relationship. And I let them know, like, for me, you coming to Cal State San Bernardino, to me, that's a plus. I want to ensure that you feel comfortable and that you know you have us as a support system. And then it's all about building that trust with them, making sure that they know that there is people out there who understand their experience, or even if they don't fully understand, at least they are trying to provide that assistance. Then with our college students, so the students that we work with now, we used to do what we call healing circles, where we would invite a professional staff from the Counseling and Psychological Services, our CAPS department. But then the students started sharing like, hey, I don't really believe in mental health. I think we should really take another approach about having these conversations. I feel weird sharing with a professional about certain issues. I feel like they don't completely understand my story or my immigration status and the ways that I'm affected. So what we started doing is cafecito and tea talks, as well as undocutalks. So we choose different topics in order for us to focus on that topic. So most recently we did one with our Immigrants Rising fellow, Myra. She facilitated one, dating while undocumented, and what that's like and what that experience is like. And we ensure that during those sessions, we erase the stigma that comes with mental health, right? So the importance of seeking help, why it's important. I personally seek help, like I have a therapist and I am not afraid to say it. And I do share that with my students. And a lot of times my students come and tell me, I didn't know that someone like you can go and seek help. And it's like, yeah, it's all good. Like we're in this together, right? And so they come and share with me, like, Maria, I made an appointment, and I celebrate with them. Like, this is an accomplishment. This is one step to you becoming like a better version of yourself. and I am so proud of you. And so letting them know that and showing them how proud we are of them reaching out for help has shown us that students feel more comfortable now and are not as afraid to seek help, when it comes to the mental health. And then we do have our parent group, but I will pass that on to Olivia.
So we are so excited and grateful because we're able to institute and establish this Parent Institute thanks to the Immigrants Rising and the Catalyst Fund grant. So we are one of the 32 recipients of a 3-year grant to provide additional services or expand the services that we provide to undocumented students and their families in the Inland Empire. So we definitely want to acknowledge that. So, one of the things that as we all know and as Liliana has expressed, mental health impacts our communities dramatically. And a lot of times it's not a topic that is open for discussion so that our students feel comfortable talking with their parents about. It has this, stigma of, you're okay, there's nothing wrong with you, people have other, bigger problems and things of that nature. And again, I believe that's because they're afraid. There's fear in revealing, that they don't feel good or that they're experiencing different types of emotions. We were, when we started the Parent Institute, Immigrants Rising, Immigrant Rising Institute, we wanted to really do an assessment and ask parents what it is that they wanted these series of workshops or sessions to look like, and what were the topics that they found were of importance to them, because, while Maria and I have been working on this for years and we have direct contact with students need support inside and outside of the classroom. They need peer support, they need allies, they need institutional agents, but we're family. We're a culture where family is they're influencers, right? So we needed to bring to the table the parents so that they know what their students are experiencing and really share with them, this is what your student is typically going to go through. They need to choose classes. They're not going to go to school every Monday, Monday through Friday, unless they choose to do that. There's no, bells that are going to ring to say you will need to go to next period. I mean, things like that, kind of general type of information. But then we really got to the bottom of what are some of the things that we can do as a pair of professionals in higher ed where we can provide you with more support. So they definitely talked about, well, we need financial aid information, how can scholarships, what kind of scholarships and students look to, for, and so on and so forth. One of the topics too was mental health. And we thought, what best way to empower the parents and provide information to the parents so they can make informed decisions, right? And so that they know and they can also be advocates for their children or their students. And not only their college students, but the younger siblings, the younger kids, their younger children, who are most likely going to look up to their older brother and sister to be their role models, right? And we learn and we teach in that way. So we were excited because, as a matter of fact, one of the parents that attended, the mental health sessions, which was facilitated by our CAPS, counselors, our counseling and psychological services counselors, this professional staff, the parent invited or shared with her student, how important it was to talk with a counselor about whatever that trauma that student was experiencing, whether that was anxiety or depression or, because the parent realized after attending the session with us that we cannot solve all of our problems. And it's okay, to go to someone that is totally kind of removed from the situation, but can provide a perspective that is going to help the student heal or deal with, you know, the concerns that they may have and the anxiety that their status may bring to them, or whatever experience we may have had in the classrooms. And just like Liliana mentioned, many of our students express their frustration, their disappointment, the racism that happens in the classroom once faculty and all of our campuses, some of them are not friendly, and it goes beyond friendly. They're racist. You know, they don't understand, or once they know that the student is undocumented, their whole demeanor and the way that they treat our students is completely different, right? So all of those things bring stress and trauma to these students. So for us, a proud moment was when it was the families who were actually encouraging their children that it's okay to seek help and to talk with someone about their experiences and how to deal with stress and the trauma that they go through, you know, maybe not on a daily basis, but it takes only one encounter, one negative encounter, whether in the classroom or outside of the classroom, you know, to really negatively impact the well-being of our community.
Yeah, I mean, it's so like almost just like even our perspective on, you know, you impacting the perspective of the parents can lead to them being the advocates. I mean, it's like now an entire community supporting the student versus like, I'm trying to get you to do something, but your whole perspective is that you're not supposed to, or it's weird to talk to someone. Now the parent got it, like they understood it, and they're your best advocate, you know, for them, for that student. It's so, so great. And I love how you all are also reaching, again, the high school students, the college students, and the parents, and revisiting strategies and you know, listening. I hear you listening to the people, like what Lily mentioned, people-centered approach. Like you're listening to them and really serving them with what they've asked for. So I constantly, in your speaking, I hear a versus like, I'm laying this on you. It's like, what do you really need and what can we provide? And then you provide them what they're looking for, which is really, really speaks highly of your work.
Yeah.
And if people want to contact you all, here's their contact information. So Olivia Rosas and Maria Maldonado, so that you can reach them, and also you can ask them questions directly. And is there anything you want to say to just wrap up your invitation to the folks on the webinar?
Sure. I think, you know, we're partnering with a community organization because most of the sessions that we have held for the parents are on our campus. Mm-hmm. And we know that sometimes transportation is problematic for some of the parents. So what we're doing is that we have identified a community organization that works closely with the San Bernardino Diocese here in our community. And so we have a church that has expressed interest in letting us use their facility so we can take our sessions to the community. You know, where again, going back to Liliana's great work, I'm so excited to read your work, Liliana, is we need to be where they're at. We need to meet them where they're at, wherever they may take. You know, so we know that, again, that our community, you know, understands or feels comfortable in a place of worship, right? So we will go, you know, to that community to provide services there as well.
Right, because that's where they're at, right? Yeah, very good. Very good, very good. Well, thank you everyone for joining today, for all of you who, Lily, Olivia, Maria, really for your expertise, for your wisdom, for your, really your heart in doing this work and impacting students and impacting the lives of people who do not have legal status, right? And so for all of the educators, we trust that you took something away with you. If you need to reach folks, again, here's the contact information. For Lily Campos, it's Lily, can you write your email on the chat box?
Yes.
Yeah, let me write it on the chat box again so you all can have that. And if you all need to reach me, you can find me on our website, immigrantsrising.org. You can just search me. My name is Estefania Hermosillo, and it was a pleasure to be with all of you today. I took a lot for myself out of this presentation, so thank you.